The Shroud of Turin, which is believed to have wrapped Jesus' body after his crucifixion, is a seemingly inexhaustible source of discoveries and disputes for humanity worldwide, some seeing it as a simple icon symbolizing the death and resurrection of Christ, while others remain convinced of its authenticity because of the numerous studies supporting this idea. Dr. John Campbell recently discovered something truly amazing about the Shroud of Turin. One of the studies collected and shared with the public by Dr. John Campbell stands out with its conclusions regarding the true age of the burial cloth of Christ. Moreover, there is a wealth of documents from various other studies that aim to affirm the existence of this sacred cloth. So ultimately, which conclusion is accurate? What role does science play in the journey of faith? The Shroud of Turin does not belong to this age. A piece of linen about 14 feet long and 4 feet wide, the shroud bears bloodstains and the faint brownish image of a man's body, front and back, with wounds corresponding to those described in the Bible of the death of Jesus. Recently, the Roman Catholic Church announced that the Shroud of Turin could not be authentic because new scientific tests show that the linen dates from the Middle Ages. The shroud's custodian, Anastasio Cardinal Balestrero, revealed that radiocarbon tests conducted independently by 3 laboratories this year had concluded that the shroud cloth was created between 1260 and 1390. While church officials did not contest the test results, they said further research and evaluation would be necessary before the origins of the shroud were clearly established. "These tests do not close the book on the shroud," said Cardinal Balestrero, who is the Archbishop of Turin. "This is but another chapter in the shroud's story, or, as some would say, in the mystery of the shroud." The results of the carbon dating were eagerly awaited by believers and skeptics alike. The shroud's authenticity has been debated since it was first put on display in the mid-14th century, and in recent years it has been the object of intense scientific research, growing religious devotion and spreading curiosity. Despite the successful dating of the linen, Cardinal Balestrero emphasized, "After all this research, we do not have any plausible answers to explain how the image of Christ was created." The tests reported were on small patches of cloth that did not contain any of the dark spots that had been described as the image of Jesus. Many hypotheses advanced. So far, no conclusive, undisputed evidence has emerged to support any of the many hypotheses advanced by scholars to explain the image. One theory holds that the image was formed from particles of iron oxide, protein, and mercuric sulfide mixed by a forger to mimic human blood. Another theory advanced in recent years is that organic residue left on the cloth by some person was discolored by heat and aging to produce a brownish image. Whatever the case, tests far more extensive than any conducted so far would be needed to solve the puzzle of the image. In the Middle Ages, many objects appeared in Europe that were said to be the shroud of Jesus, fragments of his cross or other relics, but most were discarded as fakes long ago, and few others maintain a devoted following, as does the Shroud of Turin. Shroud has produced miracles. Cardinal Balestrero said, "The exceptional evocative power of the image of Jesus Christ should be preserved," adding, "I can assure you that the Holy Shroud has produced miracles and continues to." The shroud, which belongs to the Pope, has been kept for the last 410 years at the Cathedral of Turin, where it lies folded inside a silver casket. It is rarely put on public display. Millions of visitors came to see it when it was last exhibited in 1978, and at the same time a variety of scientists took the opportunity to subject the cloth to a series of analyses. In 1984, scholars presented the Vatican with a proposal for radiocarbon dating. After long negotiations with the church authorities, a plan for the dating analyses was announced early this year. The 3 laboratories selected by the church to conduct the tests were at Oxford University, the University of Arizona, and the Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich. Each laboratory was given a postage stamp-size piece of the shroud, as well as control specimens of various ages, but only the British Museum, which coordinated the research, knew officially which specimen came from the shroud. Types of carbon compared. All the tests involved the same techniques. The sample's carbon atoms were brought to high energy in nuclear accelerators, and the percentage of carbon-14 was measured in comparison with other types of carbon. The procedure indicates an object's age because carbon-14 decays radioactively at a steady rate over time, changing its ratio to other types of carbon that do not decay. Cardinal Balestrero said that when Pope John Paul II was informed of the results, his response was, "Publish it." Luigi Ganella, scientific advisor to the Turin Archdiocese, said he was satisfied that the results from the 3 laboratories coincided to produce a 95% margin of accuracy, and that proper procedure had been followed to decontaminate the cloth from any particles of matter that could have distorted the dating. A full report on the analyses is being prepared for publication in a scientific journal, he said. Both Dr. Ganella and Cardinal Balestrero expressed their annoyance and disappointment that unknown members of the research effort had violated a voluntary secrecy agreement by disclosing the test results to the press. But both church officials said they were willing to consider future research projects on the shroud. The definitive investigation. French historian Jean-Christian Petitfils is one of the researchers who are passionate about finding the evidence of this precious linen cloth. The 4 decades he has devoted to the study of the shroud have convinced him that the face unveiled to the world by the Italian photographer Secondo Pia in 1898 is indeed that of Jesus Christ in the tomb. His extensive investigation, which compiled and analyzed all the studies ever made on the precious relic, including the famous carbon-14 study that cast doubt on the authenticity of the shroud, was recently published under the title Le Shroud de Turin, l'enquête définitive, namely The Shroud of Turin, the definitive investigation, rekindling intense debate on the subject, unveiling of the first recreation of the body of Christ based on the Shroud of Turin in Spain's Salamanca Cathedral. A historian specializing in the Ancien Régime, the political system of the Kingdom of France until the French Revolution, Petitfils is a Catholic who is also the author of highly acclaimed works on the life of Jesus. He has been interested in the Shroud of Turin for 44 years, and it has fascinated him for the historical, archaeological, and scientific mystery it represents. It remains that the shroud gives us information about the passion of Christ. We know, for example, that he was flogged very violently, in the Roman way and not in the Jewish way, with a flagrum, which had 2 small balls and a barbell between them, the trace of which can be seen under a microscope. We can see that he was indeed crowned with thorns, that he was speared on the right side. The type of Roman spear used has even been identified, as there were several of them. He was really surprised by the results of the carbon-14 analysis in 1988 to 89, insofar as they were in contradiction with very reliable previous works, such as those of Professor Pierre Barbet of the Saint-Joseph Hospital, who established a relationship between the Passion of Jesus and all the available information about the shroud, or those of Professor Paul Vignon in the 1930s, showing an absolute and perfect correspondence between the iconography of Christ, which appeared as early as the end of the 4th century, and the face of the man on the shroud. A change of iconographic model occurred at this time, which corresponds to the arrival of this precious linen in the city of Edessa in present-day Turkey. It therefore seems impossible that a forgery could have been made in the Middle Ages, in the years 1260 to 1390, that is, the range provided by the radiocarbon laboratories. In addition, since 1978, the work of STURP, the American research group created by John Jackson, which had the shroud at its disposal for 2 days, and carried out, with several tons of material, very thorough analyses, including microchemical tests of spectrography, infrared radiometry studies, optical microscopy, ultraviolet fluorescence, etc., demonstrated that the author was not a medieval forger. In 2017, it emerged that the raw numbers, obtained thanks to young researcher Tristan Casabianca, showed an even greater dispersion in the results, so that statistically, there is only a 1% chance that the samples come from the same tissue. Of course, it is not the carbon-14 method that is at fault, but the linen, which is extremely polluted. Traces of fungus and calcium carbonate were found. Raymond Rogers, a very fine chemist who died in 2005, discovered that the sample area corresponded to a darned area. Modern threads were inserted in the 16th century in order to repair this area that had been worn away. Thus, the carbon-14 experiment is null and void today. Other work has been done since then, including by Professor Giulio Fanti of the University of Bologna, who from another method of dating based on the twisting of linen, arrived at a fairly wide time range, but which revolved around the pivotal axis of the year 33, the date of the burial of Jesus. Just recently, in April 2022, another Italian researcher, Professor Liberato De Caro of the Institute of Crystallography of the Italian Consiglio Nazionale delle Ricerche, using a particular X-ray method, came to the conclusion that this is indeed a linen from the 1st century. To this end, he compared a thread of this linen with another, taken from a cloth found at Masada, a citadel that the Romans stormed and destroyed in the year 73. After all, Jean-Christian Petitfils came to the conclusion quite early that the Shroud of Turin could not be a fake. It is the reason why he wanted to publish this book. It is no longer possible to say that it is a medieval cloth, nor that it could probably be the Jesus' shroud. No, its authenticity can no longer be disputed. Some last points. The combination of the above evidence is exceedingly difficult to explain in any way other than the burial cloth is that of Jesus of Nazareth. Moreover, the formation of the image by an intense outburst of vacuum ultraviolet radiation is suggestive of a resurrection event similar to that described in the Gospels. The above scientific evidence requires that a new carbon dating test be done, which observes the standard protocols for sampling. When these protocols are observed, it would be surprising if the result was not similar to the results of the 4 new dating methods mentioned above, approximately AD 50. If this result is obtained, it would indicate that the Shroud of Turin is very likely the burial shroud of Jesus Christ, with evidence suggestive of his resurrection in light. While we currently do not have a definitive explanation for how this unique and mysterious image was created from the body of a deceased man, the most plausible current hypothesis comes from a combination of 2 teams of researchers. Dr. John Jackson's team studied the shroud and proposed the vacuum ultraviolet radiation hypothesis in 2008. According to Jackson, an intense burst of vacuum ultraviolet radiation produced a discoloration on the uppermost surface of the shroud's fibrils without scorching it, which gave rise to a perfect, 3-dimensional negative image of both the frontal and dorsal parts of the body wrapped in it. Currently, we know of no natural explanation for the seemingly unique occurrence of such a burst of vacuum ultraviolet radiation from either a decomposing body or the geological atmospheric conditions within a tomb. Though this is suggestive of a possible supernatural origin of the radiation, perhaps as a part of Jesus' resurrection, we cannot prove this scientifically, because we cannot construct a scientific test for a supernatural cause. All we can do is eliminate every known natural cause of this seemingly unique radiation. The uniqueness and current inexplicability of this phenomenon gives us reason to believe that God has given us evidence of Jesus' resurrection. This belief can be strengthened by further understanding of the light phenomenon that seems to be the source of the image, as well as the continued elimination of natural causes for it. The most convincing seems to be the hypothesis of Jackson. Scientists show the likelihood that sometime after the blood deposits had dried on the shroud, the decomposing body in the shroud emitted a short, intense burst of vacuum ultraviolet radiation that led to a dehydration and discoloration of the frontal and dorsal parts of the shroud, giving rise to a perfect photographic negative image. Jackson's research also suggests that the body inside the shroud became mechanically transparent and emitted light evenly from every three-dimensional point within it. This allowed the frontal part of the shroud to collapse, creating an image of both the inside and outside of the hands, as well as a double image on the frontal part of the shroud. Currently, the known laws of physics cannot explain how a decomposing body can emit an intense burst of vacuum ultraviolet radiation. Furthermore, they cannot explain how such a body could become mechanically transparent and emit light from every three-dimensional point within it. So, where does that leave us? If Jackson's explanation continues to be the only one to explain away the enigmas, and if future articulations of the laws of physics cannot explain how a decomposing body could become mechanically transparent and evenly emit vacuum ultraviolet radiation from every three-dimensional point within it, then we are left at the brink of a trans-physical or metaphysical explanation. Under these conditions, it would be both reasonable and responsible to believe that a trans-physical cause interacted with the decomposing body to transform it into an intense burst of light. Evidently, we cannot scientifically prove a trans-physical cause because science is restricted to the domain of physical causation. However, if the above conditions hold, we can reasonably infer the possibility and perhaps the likelihood of such a trans-physical cause. This is sufficient for reasonable and responsible belief. Does this trans-physical explanation of the shroud's image point to the resurrection of Jesus? Jesus' resurrection was not a resuscitation of a material corpse, but rather a transforming event that gave rise to what St. Paul called a spiritual body, a body transformed in glory, spirit, and power. Could this transformation of a material body into a burst of intense light signify the beginning point of the transformation of Jesus' body from a physical one to a spiritual, glorified one? Though there can be no scientific proof of this, it is a reasonable inference from the parallels between the explanation of the shroud's enigmatic image and the testimony of St. Paul and the Gospel writers. In this sense, we might say that the image on the shroud presents a clue, even a relic, of Jesus' resurrection. Why would we think the body in the shroud was that of Jesus? It is exceedingly improbable that the shroud is a medieval forgery. First, there are no paints, dyes, or other pigments on the shroud, except for the small flecks coming from the sanctification of icons and paintings which touched it. Second, the anatomical precision of the blood stains, which are real human blood that congealed on the shroud before the formation of the image, are in precise anatomical correlation to the image itself. How could a medieval forger have accomplished this? Third, it is exceedingly difficult to explain how pollen grains indigenous to Palestine appeared in abundance on a shroud of probable Semitic origin, if it originated in medieval Europe, and how coins minted in AD 29 in Palestine appeared on the eyes of the man on the shroud. How could a medieval forger have duplicated these first-century Palestinian characteristics of the shroud? Fourth, the 5 enigmas of the image on the shroud almost certainly preclude a forgery. How could a medieval forger have used vacuum ultraviolet radiation to discolor the cloth on the uppermost surface of the fibrils? How could he have created a perfect photographic negative image? How could he have created a double image on the frontal part of the shroud? And how could he have known how to duplicate the interior and exterior of the hands in perfect proportion to each other? Thus, it does not seem reasonable or responsible to believe that the shroud is a medieval forgery. Beyond this, there are 3 probative kinds of evidence pointing specifically to Jesus' place and time of origin and to his unique crucifixion and resurrection. The material of the shroud, the pollen grains on it, and the coins on the man's eyes all have their origin in first-century Palestine, the place where Jesus was purported to have died. The blood stains come from a crucifixion event identical to the one described in the four Gospels, which was very unusual, if not unique in many respects, such as being crowned with thorns, being flogged, and being pierced with a Roman pilum. The 5 enigmas of the shroud's image point to a trans-physically caused burst of vacuum ultraviolet radiation from a mechanically transparent body. This is suggestive of the transformation of Jesus' body from a physical one to a spiritual glorified one, as reported by St. Paul in the four Gospels. The spiritual glorified transformation of Jesus' body was unique to the Christian view of resurrection. It was not known in Judaism, which held to a resuscitation of the flesh, or pagan cults, which held to ethereal or ghost-like views of immortality. Thus, the enigmas on the shroud's image point to the uniquely Christian view of resurrection implied by Jesus' risen appearance. The odds of this first-century Palestinian burial shroud, with the unique features of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection, being that of anyone else, is exceedingly remote, inasmuch as the image is not a forgery and that it originated from a real person living at the time of Jesus, crucified in the unique way of Jesus and producing a burst of intense vacuum ultraviolet radiation from his decomposing body. Who else would it be? Given all this, we might reasonably infer that the shroud is the burial cloth of Jesus, which contains not only a relic of his crucifixion, but also his resurrection in glory. If so, it shows both the truth of the most significant event in human history as well as the accuracy of the gospel accounts of it. The greatest message of the Shroud of Turin. The Holy Shroud of Turin is primarily given to a relic now preserved at Turin, for which the claim is made that it is the actual clean linen cloth in which Joseph of Arimathea wrapped the body of Jesus Christ. This relic, though blackened by age, bears the faint but distinct impress of a human form, both back and front. If the marks we perceive were caused by human body, it is clear that the body, supine, was laid lengthwise along one half of the shroud, while the other half was doubled back over the head to cover the whole front of the body, from the face to the feet. The shroud was brought into Turin, Italy, in 1578, and has been kept in the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist in Turin since 1694. The shroud goes on exhibition only a few times a century, and when it does, millions of people slowly file past it to see the front and back images of the crucified man. The shroud is woven from linen thread made from the stems of the flax plant. In making linen thread, flax fibers are separated from the rest of the stem by allowing the stems to rot in water. The diameter of these fibers is about 15 to 20 which is about 1/5 of the diameter of a human hair. A typical linen thread contains about 100 of these fibers. Luke and the other 3 Gospels include this account of Jesus' burial after his crucifixion. On the morning of Jesus' resurrection, Luke records that Peter saw the strips of linen by themselves, whereas the Gospel of John states that Peter saw the strips of linen lying there, as well as the cloth that had been wrapped around Jesus' head. The cloth was still lying in its place, separate from the linen. This separate cloth has generated passionate interest today because many people think it might be the Shroud of Turin, believed to be Jesus' burial cloth. If true, the shroud would provide compelling evidence for the truth of Christianity. But is it really Jesus' burial cloth? What we know and what we don't know. The answer to that question relies on historical, scientific, and biblical data, as well as input from many other disciplines. Often, the actual data and the popular conception don't line up well and make it difficult to understand the complex issues surrounding the shroud. It seems indisputable that the shroud came from someone who was crucified. Further, the image and stains on the shroud validate the Bible's description of crucifixion. As physical evidence of that restoration, the shroud presents a mirror of the gospel, which is sacrificial love beyond all fathoming. Everything depends on it and is downstream from it. Everything else is scaffolded on this revelation. Jesus told us, "Take up your cross each day and follow me," meaning that his cross and passion are inextricably woven into the life of his followers. The Paschal mystery, Jesus' passion, death, and resurrection, is the source and summit of Christian life. If you look at the Gospels themselves, they are passion narratives with long introductions. Pope Benedict XVI stated, "Don't be afraid of the cross. It's the source of every blessing." The wounded Christ, clearly depicted on the shroud, invites the faithful to claim his wounds, as well as their own, as a conduit of grace. They are precisely where his grace flows into us. Jesus, upon his death on the cross, descended into the world, filling it with light and hope. When light shines in darkness, the darkness is dispelled. So it is when Christ freely lays down his life and takes it back up. He's showing himself as being utterly of a higher order, Dr. Dalton pointed out. In truth, God has already definitively won the battle. The only question is, are we remaining in Christ? Christ, the head, is already seated in glory. If we're members of his body, if we remain with him, we are co-heirs. Regarding Jesus' death and resurrection, we have the documents. We have Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and others. And we have monuments, namely, archaeological objects such as the Shroud of Turin and the Sudarium of Oviedo, the latter being the cloth that covered Jesus' face while he was taken down from the cross. These objects are consistent with scriptural accounts of Jesus' passion and death. Not only are they compatible with the biblical narrative, but they're mutually illuminating. The artifact on one hand and the narrative on the other hand, both shedding light on each other. Every attempt to reproduce the shroud by any naturalistic means has failed. People can't do it in a lab, especially not at the micro level. Every detail, from the shape of the body and the ratios of one limb to the other, to the blood flows, to the folding of the thumbs from damage to the nerves in the hands, is captured with medical precision. In-depth studies of the shroud in the 1970s ruled out the presence of varnish, pigments, brush strokes, directionality, or any trace whatsoever of human artwork. Nor was the image produced by heat or by any type of photography, which wasn't invented until the 19th century. There are multiple hypotheses for how the shroud came into being, but none can be scientifically proven. That's where Christians need to step up and say, what if it was not created by naturalistic means? What if it's the natural result of a supernatural occurrence? The message of the Shroud of Turin is the same as that of the gospel narratives of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. God's unfathomable love. Jesus shows divine love in ways that we simply cannot doubt. It is in deed and in truth that he loves us. And when you look at the cross, when you're looking at his image in the shroud, you're seeing him say, "I love you." You must know this. Every detail in the biblical narratives of the Passion reveals some aspect of that love. It would be too easy to glance over the details of the Passion, but the shroud forces you to pause on it. The cross was the means by which Jesus, who had emptied himself of glory in becoming human, returned to his glorified state at the right hand of the Father. In order to follow Christ, people must take up their own crosses in the form of the trials they face each day. Jesus tells us, "I am the way, the truth, and the life." So, can we expect any other pathway than the one he showed us? Learning about and venerating the shroud inevitably leads to a deeper understanding of the mission Jesus came to fulfill. Beholding and contemplating the image of Christ causes transformation to come within us. In that way, the shroud is just the doorbell. It says, "Come in." The shroud offers an astounding opportunity and a credible means of sharing the gospel with people who do not yet believe. Our faith is not about fairy tales or fables, but an event in history that actually took place. We celebrate the incarnation, that the Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. From that place, he's reborn into glory. That's a picture of what we all must also do. we die with him in order to rise with him. Because of its holy meaning, you may wonder how to visit the Turin Shroud. If you're traveling to Turin or the surrounding areas, you must visit the Turin Cathedral, where the Holy Shroud is kept. But bear in mind, the original cloth is not on public display. The shroud is in such a fragile state that it isn't put on display for the general public. It is guarded by bulletproof glass and security cameras. You can visit the chapel where it's safely kept, and you will see a replica of the shroud. The good news is that you might be able to see the real shroud in all its glory if you travel to Turin in 2025. The Pope announced that the Shroud of Turin might be displayed to the public in 2025, coinciding with the Jubilee year. Specific dates are not confirmed yet, but the Vatican will announce them soon. Hopefully. The rare display of the Turin Shroud already happened in 2000, 2010, and 2015. If it happens in 2025, or maybe 2026, it will be a big event for the Christian community and Turin. So if you plan to visit the city, you better plan it as soon as the Vatican announces the dates. If you can't make it to the 2025 Holy Shroud public display, and if only admiring the Shroud Chapel is not enough for you, there is a place where you can get more info and be a bit closer to it. The Most Holy Shroud Museum, in Italian, Il Museo della Sindone, is where you need to go. At the museum, you can learn details about the shroud's fascinating history and its many mysteries, replicas, and incredible displays of the artifact. As the focal point of centuries of controversy, the mystery of the Shroud of Turin has never ceased to spark curiosity. Dozens of studies and discoveries have been made regarding the cloth believed to have wrapped the body of Jesus, yet none seem to have fully satisfied the curiosity of those interested. That is, until recently, when Barry Schwartz, the official documenting photographer for the Shroud of Turin research project and a member of the team that conducted the first in-depth scientific examination of the shroud in 1978, revealed shocking evidence about the origin of this holy relic. It seems that this report has garnered significant public support. Could this new evidence finally uncover the truth behind this age-old mystery? Before we dive deeper into the revealed evidence, what do you think? Do we really need to rely on scientific proof to validate the true existence of the burial shroud? Leave a comment and let us know your thoughts. Now, let's get back to the video. Uncover the truth through photographs. Barry Schwartz was one of the most influential persons in Sindonology and was always a go-to guy for all of the major shroud documentaries and other media inquiries. One of his greatest legacies is his journey with the 1978 Shroud of Turin research project, where he served as the documenting photographer. His passion for exploring and investigating every piece of evidence related to the burial shroud drove his dedication and commitment to the project. In 1996, he founded the massively influential website www.shroud.com. In 2009, he founded the Shroud of Turin Education and Research Association, STERA, to which he donated all of his photographs and the website. Schwartz has conducted shroud lectures around the world and is frequently called upon as a leading imaging expert. His photographs have appeared in hundreds of books and publications and in countless television documentaries. Barry Schwartz's legacy will endure through his contributions to science, his captivating photographs and videos, and the countless lives he touched with his knowledge and kindness. He leaves behind a rich tapestry of memories and a profound impact on the world of shroud research and photography. The 1978 Project. Barry Schwartz, the official documenting photographer, explains to Glenn Beck, the team's sole mission was to determine once and for all how the famous image on the shroud's surface was formed using rigorous scientific analysis. Was it a painting, a scorch mark, or something else entirely? Schwartz himself was admittedly a complete skeptic at the outset, having no emotional ties to the shroud as an Orthodox Jew raised in a secular home. His role was simply to visually document the proceedings with a camera. Little did he know, this assignment would change his entire perspective forever. In the late 1970s, a large part of that group consisted of the Shroud of Turin research project, as known as STURP, a team of American scientists and researchers that spent over 2 years preparing a series of tests that would gather a vast amount of shroud data in a relatively short period of time. Team's primary goal was to determine the scientific properties of the image on the Shroud of Turin and what might have caused it. In October 1978, the STURP team spent 120 continuous hours conducting their examination of the shroud. The image on the Shroud of Turin was not some medieval hoax, but was caused by a supernatural flash of light, according to a team of Italian scientists. According to Vatican Insider, experts at Italy's National Agency for New Technologies, Energy, and Sustainable Development have concluded that what's been billed as the burial cloth of Jesus Christ could not have been faked. The double image, front and back, of a scourged and crucified man, barely visible on the linen cloth of the Shroud of Turin, has many physical and chemical characteristics that are so particular that the staining, which is identical in all its facets, would be impossible to obtain today in a laboratory. This inability to repeat, and therefore falsify the image on the shroud, makes it impossible to formulate a reliable hypothesis on how the impression was made. Their study involved a lot of technical use of laser lights, pulses in short-term duration, and also name checks, some of the research done by the Shroud of Turin research project headed by John Jackson, who led a team of researchers to Italy back in 1978, and still runs the Turin Shroud Center in Colorado Springs. And in medieval times, no would-be hoaxer would have access to the equipment needed to create that vision with ultraviolet light, which means that the enigma of the Shroud of Turin is still a puzzle, he says. Our interest was, and still is, that this characteristic tells us something about the science of the image, what made the image on the shroud. Now you've got a real scientific puzzle and problem to explain. Jackson has been trying to solve that puzzle for decades. Born and raised in Denver, he saw a picture of the shroud when he was 13 or 14 years old and was hooked. He's crafted solid experiments to test different hypotheses of what might have created the image. Barry Schwartz, a part of the team that went to Italy in the 70s, has done much of the photographic documentation. To this day, scientists around the world use the data gathered by STURP for their shroud research. Even the Vatican has stated that the material gathered in 1978 constitutes the official scientific data available for shroud research, and it has no plans to allow any further testing, except in the area of conservation of the cloth itself. Although the carbon dating of the shroud in 1988 yielded a 14th century date, newly discovered information has led many researchers to believe the carbon date is in error. The controversy continues. In any case, no serious study of the Shroud of Turin can ignore the immense volume of scientific facts determined from the 1978 data, and a close look at the 1978 test results must be on the agenda of any intelligent person interested in deciding for himself. Unfortunately, most of the published scientific work on the shroud has not been readily available to the general public. As believers, we do not need to see this to know that Christ died for our sins. We do not need to see the shroud to know that we confessed our sins and asked Christ into our hearts to be our Lord and Savior. Blessed are those who have not seen yet believe. Thank you, Lord Jesus, for your free gift of salvation. The scientific record. The Shroud of Turin is an infamous relic that has sparked intense debate between the religious and scientific communities for close to 600 years. First appearing in records in the 1350s, the 4.4-meter length of linen is believed to be the death shroud that Jesus Christ was wrapped in following his execution. Featuring the faint sepia image of a man with long hair and a beard, the shroud shows evidence of wounds that coincide with the biblical description of crucifixion. It has undergone various forms of scientific testing in an effort to establish its age and origin. Scientific inquiry into the shroud began in 1898 with the startling image captured by Italian amateur photographer Secondo Pia. Under normal conditions, only the vague sepia blur of a human body appears on the fabric. But when Pia examined the reverse negative of his photographic plate in the darkroom, he discovered the detailed likeness of a bearded man with visible wounds on his body. For 7 decades, indirect analyses of the image were conducted by researchers, most aimed at determining whether it had been painted onto the linen or produced through contact with a human corpse. It wasn't until 1969 that scientists were allowed to examine the fabric directly, with the task of advising on preservation techniques and future testing. This set the scene for the establishment of the US-led Shroud of Turin Research Project, STURP, which was granted an unprecedented 5 days of continuous access to the shroud itself in 1978. The project's 33 members ran the gamut of scientific disciplines, and their credentials included high-level posts at 20 major research institutions. They arrived in Turin with 7 tons of equipment and worked in shifts 24 hours a day. An associate team of European scientists acted as expert observers. Their analyses found no sign of artificial pigments. The shroud image is that of a real human form of a scourged, crucified man. It is not the product of an artist, the project's 1981 report declared. The bloodstains are composed of hemoglobin and also give a positive test for serum albumin. But the report also conceded that no combination of physical, chemical, biological, or medical circumstances could adequately account for the image. The team concluded, "Remains now, as it has in the past, a mystery." The blood on the Shroud of Turin. Scientists revealed a new analysis of the Shroud of Turin, including the composition and a microscopic analysis of bloodstains, showing that the marks are consistent with the tortures endured by Christ, as described in the Gospels. The study, titled "New Insights on Blood Evidence from the Turin Shroud Consistent with Jesus Christ's Tortures," stated that the presence of creatinine particles with ferritin, which are often a byproduct of muscle contractions, confirms at a microscopic level the very heavy torture suffered by Jesus, or Holy Shroud of Turin. Furthermore, numerous bloodstains scattered throughout the double body image show evidence that Jesus was tortured. Bloodstained marks all over the body image, which are consistent with pre-crucifixion flagellation. Blood-stained marks on the head that are consistent with a crown of thorns. Blood marks on the hand and feet that are consistent with the crucifixion, and the bloodstain on the chest that evidences a post-mortem wound that corresponds with the post-mortem spear wound that Christ received as is described in the Bible. The new study was written by Giulio Fanti, Associate Professor of Mechanical and Thermal Measurements at the Department of Industrial Engineering of the University of Padua. According to his personal website, Fanti has studied and written about the famed burial cloth since 2004. The funding for the study, the report said, was partially supported by a religious group that requested anonymity, and that the group entrusted Fanti with the analysis of the so-called Padre Pio handkerchief, a fabric on which 2 images considered miraculous are imprinted on the front and back of a Shroud of Turin like Jesus Christ and Saint Pio of Pietrelcina, respectively. According to the report, a preliminary study conducted by Fanti, along with Christian Privatera, an engineer, revealed the presence of an almost transparent substance between the blood-stained threads of the shroud. This substance, given its origin, and in agreement with other scholars who have analyzed the Shroud of Oviedo, could be the semi-transparent fluid produced by pulmonary edema, the report said, referring to the excessive accumulation of fluid in the lungs that Jesus was believed to have suffered from while on the cross. The Shroud of Oviedo, Spain, is what both tradition and scientific studies claim was the cloth used to cover and clean the face of Jesus after the crucifixion. Fanti's study on the Shroud of Turin stated that aside from confirming the gospel accounts of Jesus' torture, including the flagellation, the right eye of the man of the shroud, given that it was more sunken, with a vertical mark over the apparently furrowed eyelid, indicate that he could have been blinded by another blow of the scourge on the head. As an alternative to the scourge mark on the right eye, one can think of a wound produced by a thorn from the crown placed on Jesus' head, the report stated. The 14-foot by 4-foot shroud features a full-length photo-negative image of a man, front and back, bearing signs of wounds that correspond to the gospel accounts of the torture Jesus endured in his passion and death. The Catholic Church has never officially ruled on the shroud's authenticity, saying judgments about its age and origin belonged to scientific investigation. Scientists have debated its authenticity for decades, and studies have led to conflicting results. A 1988 carbon test dated the cloth to the 12th century, leading many to conclude that the shroud is a medieval forgery. However, scientists have challenged that claim by noting that the methodology of the testing was erroneous, and that the sample used in the carbon dating process was a piece used to mend cloth in the Middle Ages. A 2014 study published in the 2018 Journal of Forensic Sciences by Matteo Borini, an Italian forensic scientist, and Luigi Garlascelli, an Italian chemist, stated that blood patterns on the shroud were not consistent with those left by a crucified person. Garlascelli also posted a YouTube video of his experiment in 2015 using a live person to study the blood patterns in various positions, as well as pressing a sponge against a plastic mannequin to examine the way the fake blood flowed. However, several experts and researchers criticized the 2014 study, stating that their findings lacked the accuracy of past studies, some of which involved cadavers of men who died of hemopericardium, the pooling of blood in the heart, which is believed to be what ultimately caused Jesus' death on the cross. In his report, Fanti questioned the results of the 1988 study, stating that certain factors, including the presence of neutron radiation, transformed elements in the shroud, thus heavily skewing the results of the radiocarbon dating performed in 1988 by many centuries. The Shroud of Faith. The shroud made our faith in the gospel more real. The Bible is full of stories of miracles and signs that Jesus worked. And he says, "Even though you do not believe me, believe the works." The shroud is a sign, if not a miracle. Christianity is a historical religion. We believe that Jesus lived in a physical place and time in history that we can investigate. The Bible says the apostles saw Jesus after his death. That's strange as, let's face it, dead people don't rise from the dead. The only reasonable explanation is that they did see Jesus after his death, because why would they subject themselves to torture and death if they really didn't believe that? We all think the shroud is empirical evidence for Jesus. It has all the markings that correspond to what the four Gospels say. You can look at that face on the shroud and see the man was beaten horribly. But there's a serenity and a peace that somehow transcends that. One of the biggest reasons is that modern science is still unable to explain how the image got onto the shroud. There are just so many strange characteristics. You can't really prove it 100%, but the evidence shows that, more likely than not, it is authentic, based on a lot of different factors, including scientific, historical, and religious. Another question is, if we assume the shroud is authentic, why do you think God allowed it to exist and be preserved? Might be God used the resurrection to validate Jesus' mission, and we think he left the shroud as a gift to humankind, maybe for the doubting Thomases of the 20th and 21st centuries. Thomas didn't believe that the apostles saw Jesus, which is mentioned in John 20. He wanted more evidence, and the shroud gives you a little more evidence. Sometimes people will say, well, I don't need the shroud for my faith. And the implication is, and you shouldn't either. But we can't limit how God chooses to reach people. If God wants all people to be saved, he will probably use various means to do that. We think the shroud is a very effective means. Jesus said, "You will know them by their fruit." And you can see that the fruits of the shroud are openness and, in many cases, conversion to Christianity. Is the Shroud of Turin a medieval photograph? In the last years, the Shroud of Turin underwent the most intense and exhaustive study in its history. In 1969, 1973, and particularly 1978, literally thousands of photographs were made of the cloth and its image. With the advent of personal computers and, more recently, the explosive growth of the internet, the shroud has become far more available for study than it ever was before. Since the late 1970s, dozens of researchers, scholars, skeptics, and professional debunkers have presented their theories on how the image on the shroud was formed or described other artifacts they believe they have discovered hidden in the image. Some are based on serious science and are very credible, while others show a complete lack of understanding of the image and its properties and reveal the absence of any real research on the part of their proponents. To make matters worse, many of these theories have received wide public attention and in some cases have actually been adopted as part of the mythology of the shroud. So we're going to review the proto-photography theory proposed by Professor Nicholas Allen and present, the proto-photography theory. This theory concludes that the raw materials to produce photography not only existed in medieval times, but that a medieval photographer created a light-sensitive emulsion, coated it onto linen cloth, and exposed this medieval film using a room-sized camera obscura and a dead body hanging in front of its crystal lens as the subject matter. He goes on to claim that one half of the shroud image was exposed at a time, first the ventral and then the dorsal half. He further concludes that it would take about 4 days to properly expose each half of the cloth, needing at least 8 days to complete the entire task. Recently, he modified his theory to include a third exposure for the face, made with a different lens. To prevent the decay of the body during more than a week of exposure to the bright sunlight necessary for adequate exposure of the film, Allen suggests that the camera obscura was located in a cold climate. Allen has not been able to provide even one example of this medieval proto-photography process anywhere in art or photographic history, although he has carefully and extensively documented early historical references to lenses and cameras obscura. However, he has not demonstrated that anyone in medieval times ever combined this knowledge with the various sophisticated chemical and physical requirements of photographic science and brought them all together to make the process work. And if someone had, why didn't they create more examples of this unique art form that would have certainly made them famous? Were this truly the case, many other examples of this type of image would certainly exist, and photography would be acknowledged as a medieval science rather than one developed in the earliest stages of the Industrial Revolution. Allen also expressed his more recent belief that the shroud is actually a composite of 3 different exposures, now concluding that the facial image was made as a distinctly different and third exposure onto the cloth. He supports this claim by stating that he has recently detected spherical aberrations in the facial image on the shroud, which leads him to this conclusion. Obviously, this would make the process of creating the image even more complex for a medieval photographer and even harder to accomplish. Today, even with the advanced state of modern digital imaging techniques, such a perfect composite image could only be accurately accomplished by a highly trained photographic expert. To conclude, it was produced by a medieval photographer truly stretches the imagination. Both the ventral and dorsal shroud images do in fact include many intricate details, although Allen refers to the dorsal image as by far the worst. The dorsal view lacks the equivalent detail only because facial features and fingers are not seen from behind. However, one must not ignore the scores of scourge marks across the shoulders, back, buttocks, and legs on the dorsal image, since they in fact are excellent details that have been verified by no fewer than 3 expert forensic pathologists and anatomists. He also stated, The shroud shows stigmata that reflects the religious mores of the 13th and early 14th century. This conclusion is directly challenged by the multitude of expert forensic pathologists who have seriously studied the shroud and have unanimously concluded that the accuracy of the pathology illustrated on the cloth is precise and completely realistic. Also, Allen makes no attempt to explain the forensic accuracy of the bloodstains on the shroud, since research done by the Shroud of Turin Research Project and others has shown that there is no image underneath these bloodstains. We have been able to conclude that they were on the cloth before the image was formed. In fact, it appears that they actually acted to inhibit the image formation mechanism. Professor Allen's mechanism leaves the critical issue of the bloodstains totally unresolved. Allen's rationale for his theory is obviously based on his personal acceptance of the carbon dating of the shroud as medieval and his rejection of the image as a painting. Thus, he apparently concludes that since the shroud image is known to exhibit certain photographic properties and it does not appear to be a painting, it must be a photograph. Shroud of Turin's secrets continue to elude science. Over the 117 years since a photographic negative of the linen unexpectedly revealed the image of a tortured body, ranks of physicists and chemists have weighed in on the fabric's age and the image's composition. Forensic pathologists, microbiologists, and botanists have analyzed its bloodstains, along with specks of dirt and pollen on its surface. Statisticians have combed through mountains of data. The sum result is a standoff. Italian physicist Paolo Di Lazzaro, a leading expert on the phenomenon, told, "It is unlikely science will provide a full solution to the many riddles posed by the shroud. A leap of faith over questions without clear answers is necessary, either the faith of skeptics or the faith of believers." Looming above all other issues is what physicist Paolo Di Lazzaro calls the question of questions: how the image was produced regardless of its age. Every scientific attempt to replicate it in a lab has failed. Its precise hue is highly unusual, and the color's penetration into the fabric is extremely thin, less than 0.7 micrometers, 1/30th the diameter of an individual fiber in a single 200-fiber linen thread. Di Lazzaro and his colleagues at Italy's National Agency for New Technologies, Energy, and Sustainable Economic Development, ENEA, conducted 5 years of experiments, using state-of-the-art Excimer lasers to train short bursts of ultraviolet light on raw linen in an effort to simulate the image's coloration. The ENEA team, which published its findings in 2011, came tantalizingly close to approximating the image's distinctive hue on a few square centimeters of fabric. But they were unable to match all the physical and chemical characteristics of the shroud image, nor could they reproduce a whole human figure. The ultraviolet light necessary to do so exceeds the maximum power released by all ultraviolet light sources available today, says Di Lazzaro. It would require pulses having durations shorter than 1/40 billionth of a second and intensities on the order of several billion watts. If the most advanced technologies available in the 21st century could not produce a facsimile of the shroud image, he reasons, how could it have been executed by a medieval forger? For believers, the radiation thesis suggests that a divine light in the tomb might have seared the crucified form of Jesus Christ onto the shroud. One could look at hypotheses outside the realm of science, a sort of miracle, says Di Lazzaro, but a miracle cannot be investigated by the scientific method. References to various divine images of Christ, some explicitly described as burial sheets, reach back 15 centuries. Whether or not any was the linen known today as the Shroud of Turin is uncertain. The history is clearer after 1353, when a French knight, Geoffroy de Charny, acquired the shroud and deposited it at a monastery in Lire, France, 130 miles east of Paris. By the early 16th century, it had been moved to the city of Chambéry, where it was damaged by a fire in 1532, leaving scorch marks and water stains that are still visible on the fabric. Its owner by then was the aristocratic House of Savoy. In 1578, the Savoys moved the shroud to their capital, Turin, It has been there ever since, housed in the royal chapel of the Cathedral of St. John the Baptist. In 1983, it was legally turned over to the Catholic Church. The Vatican takes no official position on the shroud's authenticity, although it encourages the faithful to venerate it as a symbol of Christ's suffering. As Pope John Paul II put it in 1998, the Church entrusts to scientists the task of continuing to investigate. Shroud of Turin still surrounded with mystery and passion. At first glance, the rust-colored image of the man on the world's most famous strip of linen is faint and almost cartoonish. It was this strange sight that drew pilgrims from the 14th century, when the burial cloth of Jesus first came to light in France. It was moved to Turin, Italy in 1578, and has been attracting visitors to the northern Italian city ever since. The global shroud phenomenon really took off in 1898, when amateur photographer Secondo Pia became the first person to photograph it. While developing the pictures, Pia realized that the photographic plate showed what appeared to be a perfect, negative image of a bloodied and bruised man. An image that could not be seen with the naked eye. Even before Pia's discovery, the shroud was controversial. In 1390, Pierre d'Arcy, the Bishop of Troyes, wrote to the Pope declaring it a fake, designed to attract gullible tourists. Believers and skeptics have tussled over its origins ever since, as the crowds continue to line up in Turin. With the discovery of the negative image, proponents of the shroud still insist that the man in the image, face swollen and bruised, hands and feet punctured by nails, and back scourged by Roman whips, is Jesus Christ. Skeptics, however, say it's a clever medieval fake. Both sides claim they have evidence that backs them up and discount the research that points to the opposing view. Science should have had its final say in 1988, when radiocarbon dating established that the fabric of the shroud originated from 1260–1390 AD. Those who believe in its authenticity say that the carbon dating was wrong, that perhaps the samples were taken from a section of the cloth that had been reworked in the medieval period, or that a first-century earthquake in Jerusalem may have warped the results. The carbon dating process destroys the sample, so retesting is impossible. Some claim they've found traces of what might be 10th or 11th century Byzantine coins on the material. Others insist the bloodstains aren't at the correct angle for a real crucifixion. There are claims the threads actually date from 300 BC, 400 AD. Some say it was daubed in pigment and baked in an oven. Others claim it was made by a burst of UV light, since lasers are the only thing to come close to replicating it. When one of the carbon dating team from Oxford University appeared to cast a sliver of doubt over the tests, entertaining the idea of contamination, the shroudies were delighted. But not only does the research into the shroud continue, Christians and non-Christians alike continue to pile into Turin Cathedral to see the artifact. Because of its fragility, it's not generally on show to the public. Instead, it's laid out flat to avoid damaging the material by folding it in a custom-made glass case, which is itself inside a casket draped in swathes of red material and divided from visitors by bulletproof glass. The shroud is brought out for irregular ostensioni, or showings, at the discretion of the Pope. The last time this happened was in 2015, under Pope Francis. Over 2 million people lined up to see the shroud on that occasion. To mark Easter worship during the 2020 lockdowns imposed as a result of the coronavirus, images of the shroud were digitally live-streamed to faithful around the world. On an average year when the shroud is not on display, around 200,000 people visit the chapel annually, says the cathedral, although it's hard to be precise with numbers. Relics are artifacts that the Church believes to be real, but the shroud is not classed as a relic. Pope Francis has instead called it an icon of a man scourged and crucified. Yet true believers want to see it regardless.